My friends, the extraordinary thing about our sound system is I have the ability to talk over the top of you whenever I wish. For those interested in participating in a conversation, I invite you to come and have a seat. For those, let me just make sure that the foyer's on. For those interested in having a break outside, this is your 2-minute warning. I'm going to turn the foyer speakers off so you can pleasantly ignore me out there whilst having a break. We all have our different Yom Kippur rituals and our different Yom Kippur needs. We'll make a start in a moment or two. For those of you upstairs, our sound system should have you hearing me just fine, so feel free to sit comfortably and not have to realign yourselves. So I'm sure that this is a rabbinic no-no. Rabbi Kippen, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I'm about to ask a question I probably shouldn't, particularly on the Day of Atonement, but I'm fairly confident I'll get an accurate answer on this day, perhaps. Could I just so I can shape my remarks, get a show of hands, who within this room right now is with us on second day Rosh Hashanah? Okay. There'll be some repetition, I apologize, as I look to catch others up and then take us forward together. But as those of you who were with us on Rosh Hashanah morning, I stood up in front of the congregation and said that I got asked a question on first day Rosh Hashanah as the congregation was leaving. I got asked by a member of our community what Jewish tradition had to say about the refugee crisis that is currently enveloping Europe, but let's not pretend that it's not a crisis that is consuming our entire world. And what particularly does Jewish tradition have to say about it? It was an incredibly timely question. I don't know whether the questioner, although I've communicated with him, was aware of how timely it was, because I wasn't quite sure what I needed to say on second day Rosh Hashanah. That's very different from I wasn't sure what I was going to say, because I had a sermon written, but I wasn't sure it was what I needed to say or whether it was what the congregation needed to hear. So I went home, I excused myself from lunch, the joys of being a rabbi, and I broke all the rules. I opened up my computer, my iPad, and I began to read and re-educate myself. And as I read, I found myself taken by a number of conversations I'd had in a variety of different places through the month of Elul. As many of you have heard me say, have heard me teach, Elul is an extraordinary gift to us in our tradition, because it comes to tell us that it is absolutely impossible to arrive on the 1st of Tishrei and begin anew. One of my teachers used to joke that New Year's resolutions made on the 29th or 30th of December seldom made it past the 2nd or 3rd of January. The same is very, very much true of our Jewish New Year resolutions. And so we need all of those days, 40 days in fact, it's the 30 that lead up to Rosh Hashanah, and then the 10 extra that carry us from Rosh Hashanah to this Yom Kippur. 40 days in all, a big number, a really important number in our tradition. 40 days in all to refocus ourselves on who we are, what we think, what we do, and perhaps most important and perhaps most difficult, why we do it. Now, depending on where your family comes from, what your tradition is, there are many different Jewish communities that approach the period of Elul with different, very meaningful customs. If you've ever spent time in a Sephardi community, they have the slichot prayers which we offer once, all month long. In the middle of the night, with their tea and nana, that sweet tea, fortifying them through the evening, seeking forgiveness, seeking the opportunity to stop and pause and think. Others do it just once, the Motzei Shabbat before the New Year. But whatever community we come from, whichever type of Jew we fashion ourselves as, there is one tradition that carries us all. And it is this. And so I spoke on Rosh Hashanah morning, second day, just prior to the shofar service. I reminded the community, as I've taught a number of times, that the command to blow this horn doesn't actually exist. Whether we say blow or sound, it still doesn't exist. The blind decree given to us without explanation, lishmoa kol shofar. We are commanded to hear the cry, the voice of the shofar. And it's not just the shofar. It's the whole of Rosh Hashanah. It's the entire way that we Jews are meant to approach the new year. We're meant to begin the new year by listening. There are only 2 references to that festival we celebrated 10 days ago in our Torah. Both of them are in our Machzor. I'm sure I've got them written down on one of these pieces of paper in front of me. Yes, I do. It's not the time of the day to be trying to remember. The first, you know well. Daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, chodesh hashvi'i ba'achad lechodesh yeh lachem shabbaton zikron trua mikrei kodesh. Comes to us from Leviticus and says that you should speak to the children of Israel on the 7th day of the first day of the month, on the 7th month, on the first day of the month, that there shall be a Sabbath to recall the blasting that is called holy. Then the second text comes to us a little later on. It comes to us from Deuteronomy, I believe. And it says, it's Numbers, I apologize. בחודש השביעי באחד לחודש מקראי קודש יהיה לכם כל מלאכת עבודה לא תעשו יום תרועה יהיה לכם. Again, on the 7th month, on the first day, shall be called holy. Nothing about a new year, nothing about apples and honey, nothing about lunch and dinner with family and friends. All the Torah tells us about this holiday, this time of year, is that we should cease doing our work and our labor, and we should recall, or in this case, sound the shofar. Why? A blind decree without explanation, only with Jewish tradition providing the explanation for us. What is that explanation? Because we have to begin the new year by listening. By tuning and retuning our ears to the sounds that we have blocked out. To, I suppose, spiritually clear out all of that gunk that collects in our ears. And this is the tool that tradition gives us. It is poetic, but not surprising, that the sound that this tool makes is a cry. It's Rabbi Milton Steinberg, if I remember correctly, who said that our response to this cry is to hear the weeping of humanity and to wipe away the tear from every cheek and the sigh from every lip. I'm not a chapter and verse kind of guy, but that quote I remember. To wipe away the tear from every cheek and the sigh from every lip. That is what this shofar is calling to us. And then for those of us who think that this is some sort of postmodern reinterpretation of an ancient tradition, just open up your machzor. The rabbis of antiquity chose stories to focus us, to call us to attention this time of year. What are those stories? They're stories of crying, stories of weeping, stories of when we weren't our best selves and we wanted to do better. I doubt there are very many parents in this room who got ever brought by their children to such a stark place as Abraham was taken with Isaac. But we read that story and we hear the cry, not from Isaac, not from Abraham, but from the divine voice. The divine voice who calls out twice, "Stop. Stop." Then in many communities on second day Rosh Hashanah, we continue in Genesis. We retell the story of how Hagar and Ishmael were banished, were thrown out from their home. The Torah describes beautifully, poetically, how Hagar placed Ishmael in the shade, and then she moved the length of a arrow's shot away, so that her son would not see her die, and that she would not be overcome by his tears. Why did the rabbis of antiquity want us to read this story, if not to have us hear it and then respond to it? And then there's the third story, the story of Hannah, often offered as our haftorah on the new year. This woman, this pious woman who wanted nothing more than to have a child, who took herself off to the temple and wailed and wept and pleaded to have her prayers answered, only to be met by the establishment, by being accused of, when she was lost in her prayers, being a drunkard. Society could not respond to her. It was only the divine who heard those cries and gave her Shmuel, one of our greatest prophets. I don't think my interpretation or reinterpretation of shofar is postmodern, new age, and extraordinarily liberal, although I've been accused of all of those things. I don't mind that either. I think it is authentic. I think it is legitimate, and I think it is exactly what the Jewish tradition expects of us. And so I think that this year particularly, we have a responsibility to hear the cry of the shofar. So 10 days ago, I came home from shul. I wrote a couple of letters. So happened that I wrote them to our Prime Minister, our Defense Minister, and our Foreign Minister, but by the time I delivered my sermon, they had all changed. As is the way in this country. I rewrote them the following day. And I asked them to learn the lessons of history and to do everything that they possibly could to respond to what is, without doubt, the greatest humanitarian crisis this world has seen since the end of World War II. There are, by conservative estimates, 11 million people currently wandering this earth looking for a place to settle safely. And they are crying. Their children are crying. And only a few in our world seem to be listening. I wrote to the Prime Minister, to the Defense Minister and the Foreign Minister and said, we have to do more. I acknowledged that there are very real, very tangible concerns about who these people are, where they're coming from, where they're going, and why they are looking to go there. But I also said that concerns about some does not give us permission to do nothing for all. And so I asked for action. Didn't get a response. Don't know if I'll get a response, but I asked for action. I then turned to this community and I suggested that we too need to act. I asked that we made a concerted effort to educate and inform ourselves, to learn about the refugee crisis, its roots, and the global response. I asked that each of us as individuals, as well as us as an entire community, write to our elected leaders and lawmakers and remind them of what happened in Evian in 1936, when the world turned its back on our parents and our grandparents, declaring that they did not have a Jewish problem and did not want to inherit one. And finally, I asked the community, many of you who are here today, to hear the shofar and to be shaken to action. In the days that have followed, many have said, well, Gersh, what does Jewish tradition actually teach about this? How are we actually meant to respond? I've got great concerns. And so I put together a text study, although it looks like I'm preaching at you, which is not my intention, to look at what our tradition actually says. It shouldn't surprise you that our tradition doesn't talk about refugees or immigrants or worry itself with the idea of legal or illegal. Our tradition simply talks about the stranger and how it is that we are obligated to respond to the stranger. And so in acknowledging, as I did last night, that there are some very real concerns about some seriously scary things in the world in which we currently live, I also want to make sure that we make some time to leave the headlines and to focus on the substance and to understand what our tradition teaches. So I'm going to ask for some help. Charlie, do you mind come helping? Oh. Pass these through. We're not going to get to even a third of it, but hey, it's Yom Kippur. A little bit of thinking won't hurt. Tam, could you take some of them and just run them upstairs, please? So we begin first by needing to be reminded that we should know our history. In Genesis, we are taught that the Eternal said to Abram, "Get out from your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." I'll repeat that because sometimes we forget that's where we began. Lech lecha. Lech lecha. Go forth from your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, or perhaps, and I didn't put the Hebrew here because there just wasn't enough space to fit on one page. A better translation, to a land that will be shown to you. That is where our people began. Then God said to Abraham, "Know that your descendants will be strangers in a land not theirs. They will be enslaved and afflicted for 400 years." That wasn't a post-fact revisionist call. They left where they were going to a land which they did not know, fully aware, according to our tradition, that it was going to be tough, to say the least. 400 years worth of slavery, tough. And still they went. They must have been desperate. And then perhaps my favorite reading in the entire Torah. You shall recite the following. This is what our ancestors were obligated to recite when they would bring bikurim, when they would bring offerings to the temple. They would stand in front of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy of Holies, and they would say something that perhaps many have forgotten. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Eternal, the God of our ancestors. The Eternal heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Eternal freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us, sometimes you wish you have the Hebrew, bringing us to the place, I didn't teach English, to the place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. At some of our most pivotal, important moments in our religious practice, on those Shlosha Regalim, those 3 pilgrimage festivals, when we went up to Jerusalem, we were commanded to begin or precede our offerings with a reminder that our ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and that we, their descendants, are the wandering Jews. We were strangers in a strange land. Then I went and I looked to glean, draw down on this idea of ger, of what does it mean to be a stranger. I have to be honest, I have shifted significantly over the last few months as I've grappled with this challenge. I began, like many, kind of sitting on the fence, giving thanks that I was on the other side of the world. But as I saw the news and as I dug down in our tradition, I realized it was screaming at me. Literally screaming at me like the shofar. So what are these 8 teachings? You have them in front of you. In my teacher training, I got told never to read at adults. I didn't survive very well as a teacher. You have them in front of you. Each of these texts build on the one before it. An outline that not only are we responsible to welcome the stranger, to recognize the stranger, to support the stranger, we are in fact cursed if we don't. Our tradition this time of year talks about mitzvot and averot. Commands, good deeds, badly translated, and those other things that we aren't so proud of. In primary school, I remember being taught about the scales that we're weighing up. In the one scale, we had the mitzvot, in the other, we had the averot, and we'd kind of weigh them up together. Here, we have a mitzvah to recognize, support, and welcome the stranger. And we have an avera to make the stranger feel unwelcome, to push the stranger away, and to ostracize and ignore their needs. We are literally being pushed and pulled to the same place. Earlier this week, I watched it's amazing. I used to say, and I'm not old, I used to say I read someone's Rosh Hashanah sermon. But in the world in which we live, I actually now say, I watched a Rosh Hashanah sermon from my friend, Rabbi Yael Saplansky. She's the senior rabbi of Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto, an extraordinary congregation. She has followed after some of the great giants of Jewish tradition. I know Australia is not Canada, but you know what they're doing in Canada? The government in Canada has agreed to welcome as many refugee families as they possibly can, as long as each family is sponsored by another family. You know what they did at Holy Blossom Temple? Rabbi had people signing up at the back of shul. She stopped services, pulled out pens and told people to sign up if you have space. If you've got a room, or you can throw a couple of kids in one room. If your kids have moved on, use the space. We'll find the food, we'll find all of those things that make it difficult. That there was a Jewish response to the refugee crisis. That there is what we would have really liked the world to have done in 1936, when they had the chance. Before those walls were thrown up. It's funny, I used that same line, 36, when they had a chance, before those walls were thrown up on Rosh Hashanah. And then in the last week, you know what I've seen all week? Walls. Fancy fences. How do you shut a border, 100 to 200, 300 kilometer border overnight? Well, we have the technology to do that. But yet we can't find people beds. I regrettably don't have tangible suggestions of how we can make a difference. What I do have is the ability to teach Torah. In fact, I have the responsibility to teach Torah. A teacher in Israel, that's what it says on my smicha, on my ordination. That's all I am. I'm just a teacher in Israel, and I teach text, and our text tells us, and this is not some selective text, this is everything. That's everything our tradition says about the stranger, and it all says the very same thing. I don't have a suggestion other than that which the rabbis gave. It's on the top of the next page. You know it well. You've said it and sung it around the table with your families, Seder after Seder after Seder. In every generation, a person is obligated to see him or herself as though he or she came forth from Egypt. There are 11 million people currently stuck in Mitzrayim, in a very, very narrow place. We have the ability to move them out. Whether we have the will is what's currently in consideration. I joked last night, I used the same joke. I'm really beginning to become an old rabbi when I use the same joke repeatedly. That it's my job to comfort those of you who are afflicted and afflict those of you who are comfortable. This day, we're meant to feel afflicted. This day, we're meant to feel uncomfortable. There are all of these traditions that have developed over the years, including the one that I don't follow, that one about leather shoes. Why? Because we're meant to be uncomfortable. The idea being there's nothing more comfortable than a new pair of leather shoes. Runners are very comfortable. I go back to that first week of school, when you couldn't get the blisters, couldn't get rid of the blisters. That's uncomfortable. We should have stones in our shoes. Rabbi Ettlinger should be wearing her 11-inch stilettos. There we go. Sure. Just give me 1 second. And so, my goal in this conversation, and I'm happy to take questions and make it a conversation, is to put a stone in your shoe. And I want that stone to reside there for the rest of the day. And then when we're done with what this day is all about, I want you, in a way that works for you and your family, to figure out a plan to get that stone out of your shoe. Because then we've got a possibility of making a difference. But only then. This is not something we can leave to others. A global crisis requires a global solution. And that requires each and every one of us. So.
Rabbi, I sense a small elephant in the room, although you've touched on it, and interestingly, number 6 touches on it, because it says, you shall not abhor an Egyptian. And you mentioned also the Pasha from talking about Hagar and Ishmael.
Mm-hmm.
And as I recall, one of the things that God says, an angel says to Hagar, don't worry, I'm going to make of your son a great nation, a great people. Do you think there's a discussion to be had about the fact that that great people that was coming is intrinsically royal in what's going on in the world today in terms of these crises? It's not a criticism, it's just a question. And how do Jews particularly relate to that great people? Because I've never heard any real discussion about that question.
I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is actually abundantly clear. Fundamentalism is terrifying. Whether it comes from the Quran, whether it comes from the Torah, whether it comes from the New Testament, when it comes from just being set in our ways. There are many, many, very scary things contained within the Islamic world. I also taught last night that there are a few scary things within the Jewish world as well that we should be aware of. What I do know is that there are 11 million people trying to get away from that scare and from that fear. And yes, I accept the fact that the malicious nature of terror means there probably are 15,000 within that 11 million who are using the cover of others to plan future terror. I'm not an accountant or a mathematician. I can't work out what 1,500 or 15,000 of 11 million is, but I'm prepared to take that risk. Because what happens is if we say they're Muslims, Islam is bad, we lose ourselves. We give up all that is sacred and good in our tradition. We also fail to learn the lessons of history. The world exists in civilizations. We have had golden periods and we have had very dark periods. Some of our brightest history has been written and conceived under the crescent. Now don't hear that I'm saying that I'm looking forward to living under a caliphate. I'm not saying that at all. That's the last thing I want. But I'm not prepared to ignore the fact that we have for 2,000 years, or for the majority of 2,000 years, found ways to interact with others. And I'm not so arrogant or so bold as to think that the world which I live in, the decade in which I occupy, is so different from the thousands of years that have preceded it. And I think that's a real challenge. And I don't think it's an elephant in the room. I think we have to begin with it. We have to say, there is a lot that's happening in fundamental Islam which makes us uncomfortable. We are uncomfortable, but we are not prepared to lose ourselves in that discomfort. I'm also very honest to recognize that I don't have a real suggestion of what we should do with that discomfort. I don't come with solutions, but I'm blessed that today is not a day for solutions. It's just a day for discomfort.